Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Music Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Rory O'Toole. Hope you guys have been doing well. As we barrel our way through August, this summer is going by way too quickly, but it is finally starting to feel like summer. I don't know about for you guys, obviously. We've got listeners from all over, but for those of us in Northern California, in the Bay Area specifically, this summer's been a little not so summery feeling. Put a hyphen in there. And I'm not talking about vibe. I'm not talking about attitude. I'm talking strictly weather. Especially here in the North Bay of the Bay Area, where I've been staying at a lot. There's been a marine layer just kind of chilling over this whole thing, kind of putting a damper on my idea of summer, which is sun, which is heat, which is days at the pool, days going on hikes, sweating your butt off, then jumping in a lake or in a creek. All that good stuff that makes summer summer, the stuff that makes you think of sunscreen, barbecues, tans, sunburns, flip-flops, swim trunks, all that. Hasn't really felt like that, at least July. You know, we've had these days that have gone on and off between fog and sun, and even if it's sunny, it hasn't been that hot or stayed that nice. There's been wind. Finally, though, we are here in the midst of a heat wave. I know it's not great, especially for you folks out in like Sacramento and such, where it is way too hot. And we've had rolling power outages all over California. But you know what? Here in the Bay Area, we've needed it. It feels like summer finally. I am psyched that we are here in summer, as I like to say. And speaking of summer, we're going to talk about Burna Boy, who's bringing that heat as well. The Nigerian superstar, the Fela Kuti of 2020, the real Lion King, Mr. Burna Boy. He just dropped a new album this past week. We're going to talk about it. We are also going to get into producers and why they're the unsung heroes of the music world. And then at the end, we're going to go through some music news to round it off before we send you guys off. So on that note, let's get into it. Burna Boy, new album. If you're not familiar with Mr. Burna Boy, he is a Nigerian singer-songwriter / rapper. He's back with a star-studded follow-up to last year's African Giant. That album is absolute classic, spectacular, magnum opus. You guys really need to check that one out. We're getting guest appearances on this one, called Twice as Tall, from artists such as Coldplay's Chris Martin, Stormzy, the UK grime superstar, and hip-hop icons like Naughty by Nature. And it's executive produced by Diddy, a.k.a. P. Diddy, a.k.a. Puff Daddy, a.k.a. the man all up in the video. Shout out Suge Knight. And we also get a Mike Dean production tag. We get a Timbaland production tag. And of course, all the Afro pop, Afro beat, Afro fusion production, domestic talent out of the continent of Africa helping out on this as well. So if you don't know who Burna Boy is, like I said, he's 29 years old, Nigerian singer-songwriter, rapper, just swag extraordinaire. He was from Port Harcourt in Nigeria, southeast Nigeria to be exact. And he rose to prominence around 2012 after releasing Like to Party, which was the lead single from his debut studio album. And then in 2017, as he's working his way through the scene, making especially waves in his native Nigeria, Africa, but especially in the UK, where there's a big African diaspora population, he's getting big. 2017, he signs with Atlantic Records in the United States and Warner Music Group for his international distribution. And since then, he's basically become Africa's biggest music export. He has a sound that encompasses trace of Afrobeat, throws in hip-hop, dancehall, Afrofusion. And the past few years, he's basically been concentrating on increasing his global presence. And his third release, Outside, earned him a lot of buzz. And then, like I said, African Giant was basically his international breakthrough. And this is basically the sequel to that, with Twice as Tall, him cementing himself, his legacy, letting you know he's here to stay. And apparently, according to The Guardian, in a profile he did with them, he knew he was going to be a star from the age of 2. From 2 years old, this guy knew he was going to be a star. Gives you an idea of the confidence my man has. He initially fell in love with rappers such as Naughty by Nature, who appears on this album, DMX, Big Pun, Busta Rhymes. And he also was introduced to dancehall, and his grandfather actually managed the legendary Fela Kuti, who we'll be getting into later, while his father worked in construction and his mother was a translator for the West African Chamber of Commerce. She is fluent in French, Italian, and German. I'm fluent in nothing. Definitely feel inadequate when you look at that. And he's basically become a leader amid the bounty of new African pop that has been increasingly welcomed in the West here. And that's due to the widespread availability due to streaming, the internet, and just kind of the increasing presence in the UK of artists who have African parents or African grandparents who've kind of brought artists like Burna Boy onto their songs, especially artists in the grime scene in the UK. In 2019, he won Best International Act at the 2019 BET Awards and was announced as an Apple Music Up Next artist. His fourth studio album, African Giant, like I said, released 2019, won Album of the Year at the All Africa Music Awards and was nominated for Best World Music Album, which is still a dumb name for a music category, but he was nominated nonetheless at the Grammy Awards. Did not win, which to me was crazy because African Giant, I'm going to keep saying it, is amazing. He's got a huge presence in the United Kingdom, as I've mentioned as well, and he's growing one in the US and elsewhere. He's really going for world domination at this point. And he has a sound of his own that he calls Afro Fusion, which is a mix of Afro beats and other genres, including dancehall, hip-hop. And he's not really bound into any one genre or another. And what kind of separates him from the Afro beats artists, if you listen to African Heat or Afro pop playlists on Spotify, you're just familiar with dudes like Wizkid. He's much more political than a lot of these people. So he's got as much in common with Fela Kuti as he does with Drake or Migos, to be honest, or Wizkid, which really gives him his own sound, his own style, his own brand. And he was even included on Barack Obama's 2019 Best Songs playlist with his song Anybody. And he was also tapped to be on Beyonce's Lion King soundtrack. So he's been moving and he's been making waves. Of course, UK artists like Stormzy and Dave have collaborated with him. Location, the Dave song that he featured on, was a huge summer hit. And he's also worked with Lily Allen, Ed Sheeran, Georgia Smith, and Jay Huss. And it's because he usually adds that softer melodic chorus in his guest spots and brings that credibility to some of his collaborators. And like his hero Fela Kuti, he came to the UK for an academic education and instead became a musician. And he took back some of that slang he heard in South London to Lagos. And that's when he sort of started to make his own music when he got back. And he said, only later when I started finding myself and understanding who I am did I start appreciating African music and everything my granddad had been trying to put into my hands since I was a kid. Since then, he's received glowing press coverage in the West and has seen his popularity rise, but not quite as significantly as the UK, but he's moving up there. But that kind of hints at why he's working with people like Diddy. And to just give you a sense of the significance of Burna Boy, he is essentially the spiritual successor to Fela Kuti. Now, this is probably the fifth time I've mentioned Fela Kuti. You're probably like, who is that? What is that? Well, let me explain. Fela Kuti, he's almost undefinable, indescribable, because he was that varied, that powerful, that important. Essentially, he's like John Lennon and Malcolm X rolled into one for the nation of Nigeria and for the continent of Africa. He was a band leader, saxophonist, and founder of the Afro beat sound, and a human rights activist. He was a political giant from the 1970s until his death in the late 90s. He criticized the corruption of the Nigerian government and the mistreatment of Nigerian citizens. He spoke of colonialism as the root of the socio-economic and political problems that plague the African people. And he was seen by the military junta of Nigeria, who had taken over the government in a coup in the 1960s, as he was seen as the enemy by those guys, because he was a big criticizer, critique them, and called them out for their BS. His Afrobeat genre, which he co-created along with legendary drummer Tony Allen, was a fusion of jazz, psychedelic rock, funk, and traditional West African chants and rhythms. He used music as a form of protest, entertainment, celebration, political critique, and chiefly as a call for African pride and a spiritual return to its glorious past in order to create a brighter future. We will definitely be doing an episode on him in the future because his life is that amazing and he is that important to not only Africa but to music in general. But that's just to give you some context as to where Burna is operating in and what I mean when I say he is the spiritual successor to Fela Kuti. So, like I said, he's hugely influenced by Fela Kuti. Burna Boy has a tattoo of Kuti, and his grandpa, like I mentioned, actually managed Kuti. In many ways, Burna has borrowed Fela as a framework for his own music. He's creating songs that are easy to dance to and complemented with life-affirming live instrumentation and familiar refrains, interspersed with political messaging, calls for Pan-Africanism and black consciousness. But, that being said, he's doing it his own way. 2020 is a different time, and Burna was just as much influenced by Jamaican reggae, South London grime, and American hip-hop, not only musically, but also aesthetically, in speech, and in attitude. As the New York Times wrote, for the most part, Burna Boy hasn't diluted his African heritage to reach his global audience. Instead, he has placed an unmistakably African stamp on music drawn from all around Africa and from across the African diaspora. He sings most often in a pidgin form of English and Yoruba, confident that his meaning will get through even if listeners don't recognize all the words. So he's speaking the Pidgin English that's common in Nigeria, and Yoruba, which is one of the main ethnic groups of Nigeria. He speaks their language. A lot of his songs are in that language. He also sees the newfound interest in African music as a turn toward music's origins. As he said, quote, "From what I've read and from what I've studied and from what I researched, the world started from Africa. So music must have started from Africa. And I feel like when everything starts kind of going left, like what is going on right now, everybody runs home." So he's basically saying everyone has roots in Africa. Music, therefore, has its roots in the continent as well. So it's not surprising that African talent, African music, African acts are seeing a surge in popularity the last few years. And like Fela, he has strong political convictions. Let me just highlight a few for you here. When in June, he won a BET Award for Best International Male, that's 2019, June, he used the moment to make a point about Africa, colonialism, and Black Lives Matter. He said, "I'd like to use this opportunity to say that sometime around 1835 there was a mission to turn Africa into a dominated nation. Now is the time to overturn that and go back to the royalty that we were, because in order for Black lives to matter, Africa must matter." Also, the year before, he wasn't able to accept his award, so he sent his mom in his stead, and his mom read a speech that he wrote which says, "Every black person should please remember that you were Africans before you became anything else." And he actually used that sample on African Giant. And explaining his popularity in the UK, he says, "Most of the people from the UK, if not all the black people from the UK and people of color, they know where they're from. They know exactly where their roots are. This," he says, "makes it easier for people to tune into his wavelength. It took longer for his music to find an audience in the US, he says, is a consequence of African Americans not having the same close connection with Africa. Quote, "Unfortunately, the brothers in the US have been stripped of their whole knowledge of self." So he kind of sees himself as having roots across Africa to the UK because of the recent immigration patterns, but with the US it's been harder for him to reach an audience because his style of music is less relatable to African Americans who did not grow up in that tradition or don't feel that innate connection to Africa. Another definitely most controversial opinion he has is citing Muammar Gaddafi, former leader of Libya, as one of his heroes, and not because of his authoritarian rule, because the dude was a dictator, but in spite of it, because of Gaddafi's effort to create an African monetary fund to counter the European American controlled IMF. Lastly, just to give you a sense of where he's coming from politically, he said, "The reason for everything I do and how I do it is for the one goal and one goal only, and that's the eventual unity of Africa. One day we'll have one passport, one African currency, one Africa. Then, and only then, will my mission be complete." So, he's an ambitious dude, to say the least, and music is just his vessel to deliver his larger, more powerful message and try to accomplish his lofty goals. Next, after the break, we're going to get into the album itself, Twice as Tall. You're not going to want to miss it. Please stick around for that.
Always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
And we're back. Just gave you an intro to who Mr. Burna Boy is. So let's get into his new album, Twice as Tall. Been teasing it for a while here. And just to give you another tease, we are going to be getting into some music news and the importance of producers after this. But here we are, Twice as Tall. And while it'll always be difficult for Burna Boy to top his, what I would say his magnum opus, African Giant was, this latest album is it's a good sequel. You know, sequels are rarely as good as the original, but sometimes they can approach the greatness of the original, and I think that's what we're getting here. He finds a way to balance his signature sound with hints of evolution, all while remaining true to his distinct sound and heritage. So overall, great effort here from Burna Boy. Did not love it as much as African Giant, just because African Giant had a vitality to it and energy to it that is really hard to replicate and was sort of a perfect storm for him. This is a much more measured legacy building catalog approach here, but you know what? I respect it, and you still get some great Burna tracks here and great songs. So let's get into the positives first. So the opener, Level Up, first song, it's basically a victory lap that takes in how far Burna has come so far, celebrating his success in light of friends who are still stuck selling drugs, his past feelings of inadequacy, and ultimately the validation that came when he sold out Wembley Arena in London. And this is all punctuated by African super duper star, the Senegalese singer Youssou N'Dour. Probably saying that wrong. Don't crucify me. But big deal to have him, as Burna said. To have Youssou N'Dour on this album means a lot to me. He's an African legend for anyone that doesn't know him. A real legend, and you need to know the way he represents his people too. Because the Senegalese are a really special and spiritual kind of people, and there's a real beauty to their culture. So for him and everything he means to them, that's how I want it to be when I'm done. Like I said, legacy, the way he's seen, he's talking about it in that quote there, and that's basically what he's talking about in the song as well. Then other songs like Bebo and Kama provide that familiar danceable rhythms, low-key Burna crooning, and Yoruba refrains that hint at Burna's club music roots. Wonderful is a clear, radio-friendly signal that's a good, unchallenging introduction to Burna Boy, and a warm celebration of Africa as the motherland of not only Africans, but mankind as a whole. As he says, it's important for me to show that music is a uniting force that transcends state lines, barriers, and borders. This song is about the wonders of seeing the impact of my music on people's lives as they shared their joy, pain, and pleasure with me while I toured the world. It serves as a note that no matter how far you go or how hard you work, you must be ready to come home. The pandemic forced us all to take refuge in our homes. Above all, Africa is home. It is the motherland to all people. For us to truly matter, Africa has to matter. Couldn't have said it better myself. Onyeka is a bright Afro-fusion patented classic love song that has you moving and smiling while subtly receiving messaging about Nigerian political thought leaders and cultural icons, like where the title gets its name from, Onyeka Onwenu. You also have the Naughty by Nature track, which is a collaboration with none other Naughty by Nature, who is a childhood favorite of him, 90s hip-hop legends, of course, and you get that bright, bouncy atmosphere that would have been home at an early 90s track that Naughty specialized in. And the verses by Vin Rock and Tretch are pretty good as well, which I was pleasantly surprised with, because they're definitely not in their prime anymore, but they still delivered here. Talking about the song, Burna said, I think a Naughty by Nature track was the first song I remember hearing. Growing up, they were definitely one of my favorite groups, and I literally grew up listening to these, man. So it might sound crazy or impossible to have them on my album all this time later, but I swear to you, nothing is really impossible. Even right now with all this COVID stuff going, there's a way. If you really want to make something happen, then there's always a way to do it. Trust me, it's not impossible. Damn. So we get motivational speech by Burna Boy. He's just giving it all on this, isn't he? Next highlight that I have is No Fit Vex. It's an Afro-pop moody number about friendships gone sour that Drake would feel comfortable on, honestly. And No Fit Vex is kind of a pidgin English sort of term that says, you know what, no worries. It is what it is. Another standout is 23, which is a slower and wistful piano ballad, and Michael Jordan Illusion, with the 23 in it, to Burna's greatness and accounting for his hard work that he had to commit to on his way to the top. We also have Time Flies, which is a collaboration with Afro-pop Kenyan group Sauti Sol that feels like a retro 80s synth-pop karaoke jam. I was just really surprised with that one. Did not expect Burna to hop on a track with that sort of sound on it, but worked for him, and obviously for Sauti Sol, they love to work with Burna Boy as he's sort of the African giant on the world stage right now. Wet and Day Sup, produced by Timbaland, has the big drums and bounce you want from Timbaland that feels the most like a contemporary hip-hop song. And we also have Real Life, which is a collaboration with grime superstar Stormzy that uses Stormzy not for his rapping, but for his chorus, humming, and hook-friendly voice as Burna takes the verses on this one. Also, Bank On It closes the album, which is sort of a Pop Smoke tribute and a legacy-affirming cut with a memorable chorus, big drums, and a curtain-closing mood on it. You know, using that Pop Smoke analogy to talk about, hey, my life could end at any moment like it did for Pop Smoke, even on your way to the top, even when you're doing everything you're supposed to. So it's kind of a way to talk about legacy, what he's leaving, what he's done thus far, what he wants to do, and how he's ultimately making peace with the fates and whatever comes next for him in his career and in his life. Really good album closer. Really enjoyed that. As far as negatives go, Alarm Clock, which is the second track, feels like it would have been better left as an interlude instead of an extended ditty motivational speech through the horn section. But I will say that horn section is pretty African Giant-esque and hit pretty well, but that doesn't really excuse just how unnecessary that track felt, to be honest, and to be so early kind of dampened my enthusiasm for the album as I was listening, but it gets a lot better, especially the second half of the album. But yeah, Alarm Clock, especially as a placement as a second track, I was like, this is not great. And it's like, Diddy, you're still speaking on songs. You're still, as Suge Knight said, all in the videos, all on the songs. Like, dude, take a step back, especially with Burna Boy. Like, we don't need to hear you. We appreciate what you've done for hip-hop, what you're doing for Mr. Burna Boy here, but we don't need to hear you wax your motivational spiels on us, especially in light of what Diddy's done. He has a penchant for this, kind of overshadowing the artist. It's kind of annoying, at least to me. It's just like, dude, take a step back. Also, Monsters You Made, which was a collaboration with Chris Martin of Coldplay, obviously, is going to be one of the headline-making tracks. But to me, not that great musically, just sounds sort of bland and a bit disjointed. Doesn't really find its groove, doesn't really find its comfortability. But I will say the verses on this by Burna are pretty powerful. But ultimately, it's about the music above the messaging. And if the even if the messaging's good and the music sucks, then it's not a good song. If I want good political messaging, I'll go read a book. I'll go read political philosophy. Not to undercut political messaging in music, but the music has to come first. And here the music just doesn't really do it for me. So that's a hard pass for me, but it will be making the rounds and be one of those that the press kind of eats up just because of the narrative behind it and the big names behind it. So as far as rating and takeaways here, I gotta say, with an executive producer in Diddy, I think this was an attempt at further American dominance and extending his presence here in the States, which is really smart because obviously Diddy is a mogul and has all the connections you'd want if you want to get more American play, a bigger American audience, work with more American artists. So that was smart there, and Diddy, for himself, gets to work with a huge international star, especially in the UK and Africa. So good for Diddy as well. They both got something out of it. So far, it's looking good, as I believe Twice as Tall had 5 million streams within the first hour of its release. So pretty successful partnership there. And Burna is in smack down the middle of his musical prime. It's clear that the perfect storm of hunger and vitality shown on African Giant might be harder to replicate in the future, but this was a good sequel. More importantly, Burna represents the future of African music and international relevancy in music in general, from the United States to Europe to just across the world. I believe international music is going to be huge because the borders don't matter in the age of the internet. In a globalized economy, in a globalized world, whatever your regional background is the least relevant it has ever been in world history. And with the internet, you can be exposed to any music, any musicians, as long as it finds a way to get to you. Burna Boy and other Afro beats and African artists have found ways to reach audiences in Europe, Australia, America, Canada, elsewhere, because, it's the internet. It's all accessible. It's all reachable. Easier than ever. Also, the dialogue between different nations, different continents is more common. Like, Burna Boy looking like he could be a rapper in America or a grime star in the UK is because that whole lifestyle, the music videos, the artists, they're all so visible with the internet that you can borrow the customs, the speech, the attitude, the general persona of people that you might not even know in real life, but is easily replicated and studied on the internet because of things like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, just the internet, the nature of the internet in general. It's very reachable. So I think that's great. You're already seeing it with reggaeton stars, just pop hits from across the world that reach into the American charts, and you're seeing it with Africa too, and Burna Boy specifically is at the vanguard of all of that, and I think it's awesome, and I think he's going to be here for at least a decade, maybe more. He's smack down in his prime here. So as far as a rating, I'm going to give this 4 out of 5 stars. 4 out of 5 because there are a few skippable tracks. 4 out of 5 because it's just not as good as African Giant, which is a solid 5 out of 5. One of the best albums that Africa has produced internationally in the past 10 years, maybe more. But Burna Boy is a very, very important, essential artist, not only for Africa, not only for Nigeria, but for the world, because like he said, music started from Africa. The roots of humanity, of this thing we call music, all reach back to Africa. So if we can tune into that wavelength, we can tune into good music. And on that note, let's take a break. After the break, we will get into producers and why you need to pay more attention to these unsung heroes. Stay safe. Come back after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
We back, here to talk about producers. Now, we just went over Burna Boy and his great new album, Twice as Tall. Part of what made that album so good was the production on it. I mentioned Diddy, a.k.a. P. Diddy, a.k.a. Puff Daddy, a.k.a. the man all up in the videos. That man also recruited Timbaland. Also, Burna Boy works with a lot of great producers, not name those two guys, who make his songs awesome. Because producers are the men behind the curtain, the Oz behind the awesome songs. And most people don't really care about them unless they're these super producers who are just famous for either rapping as well or for being just recognizable. Think of your Rick Rubin, who's just recognizable for looking like a homeless dude on the street but being a genius. Or Dr. Dre, who also moonlighted as a rapper before we realized, man, this guy kind of sucks at rapping. Maybe stick to the beat production part of this. That being said, in light of Martin Birch's death, and people ask me about why I mention producers so much on this show, I thought I'd go into the important role but often unsung presence producers play in songs, in albums, in music in general. So, Martin Birch, if you're not familiar, is the producer whose bright but heavy sound was applied to classic albums by Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and more. Died at age 71, I believe, 2 days ago. He worked on multiple albums with Rainbow, Blue Oyster Cult, and Whitesnake, and helped Black Sabbath freshen up their heavy metal sound after Ronnie James Dio took over from Ozzy Osbourne on vocals. His most enduring partnership, though, came with Iron Maiden, who he started working exclusively with in the 1980s. Beginning with their second album in 1981, Killers, Birch produced a string of 9 classic albums, including 1992's Fear of the Dark, 3 of them reaching UK number 1, including the classic The Number of the Beast. So, super, super important guy, especially during the hair metal era and the arena metal rock era of the late 80s, early 90s. Super producer of all that. And he is as responsible as Iron Maiden or Whitesnake or any of these other acts for being as successful and popular as they were. Now, first things first, what is a music producer? Now, according to Wikipedia, a record producer or music producer was once the overseer or operator of a musical act's sound recording and its refinement, roles that are now typically under the audio engineer umbrella, whereas today's record producers direct or create the musical sound and song structure and are mainly music composers who arrange the vocal and instrumental contributions while often coaching the musical act. The producer may gather musical ideas or samples, help improve the song's lyrics or instrumentation, hire session musicians, play instruments, co-write, or even publicly appear by name in the recording. Sometimes doubling as the engineer, the producer may supervise the entire process of creating a finished recording, pre-production, recording, mixing, and perhaps even mastering. For some projects, the producer also chooses all of the recording artists. Music producers are likened to film directors as a result, especially the auteur film directors who have nearly total control and decide every element of the film. You have a version of that in music who is kind of the music producers of today, or at least used to be. It's becoming a little less common with just the way the music industry is headed, but producers in any era, including into the future, will always play a massive, massive role. Now, there's also different types of producers, and I think it's important we go into that before we have a deep conversation about production and why it's so important. Now you have the technician who is involved in recording sessions, mixing, processing channels of sound, using software, sometimes even hardware. This is basically the standard definition of a music producer, and it's pretty damn ubiquitous. We also have the mastermind, which I just mentioned. It's another familiar perception. Kind of here's the raw, unpolished work, and can only be realized by the producer working on this kind of diamond in the rough and turning them into the superstar they're destined to be. Popular examples of this would be the work of Beatles producer George Martin or inventor of West Coast gangster rap Dr. Dre. For these producers, the role was so much more than simple pushing of buttons. It was an opportunity to shape and direct the musical result. Pretty damn instrumental, that sort of role of a producer. And from choosing strange recording locations and instruments to writing arrangements, pioneering trailblazing uses of technology, they changed the way music production was thought about and turned the process into an art in its own right. Now that's less common as major label dominance has sort of lessened and there's just smaller recording budgets these days. They can kind of outsource this thing or just make it cheaper with technology. So this sort of artistic freedom is drying up, but you still see it every now and then. And if you're a big enough name, you can kind of have the leverage to pull that sort of thing off. We also have the guru. Think of someone like Rick Rubin, who works alongside engineers who can operate the gear while he focuses on other aspects of the process. So they basically channel the musician, get on the musician's side, tap into the musician's psychology and creative center to sort of drive them in a certain direction, tap in with their sound, and build the whole process around that. So instead of being like, I'm going to direct every aspect of this, or I'm going to be the best audio engineer, the guru is someone who, like a spiritual guru, taps into your consciousness and your soul to reach a deeper understanding of where you're coming from, help you, the artist, discover who you are, what you want to say, and in that process, find the material that's going to create a great, great album and therefore a great product. So they're basically sort of like life coaches. They tap into the emotional and spiritual needs of the artist and ensure that the atmosphere of the studio is just a creative center that's going to be the most conducive to making the best performances. Now, obviously, the gurus are probably the least common because that's such a special set of skills, requires a lot of respect, a lot of experience, a lot of results. That's a lot that needs to go right. It's not very common, but when it does, it's a legendary, rare, and oftentimes successful role to play. We also have bedroom producers. Now, these are the vast majority of music producers, anonymous figures making music as a hobby or as a novice, maybe for themselves, or just as an indie strategy. It's affordable. It's all-encompassing, and it cuts out the middleman. It's all created on your laptop and just edited in cheap or free software programs. It's increasingly popular. For example, think of the Bedroom Plot playlist on Spotify or artists like Rex Orange County and Kuko. Those dudes, they're just making music, putting it on their laptop, and then releasing it on Spotify, and it's going massive. Now, producers also help shape the music, and this is what I want to talk about, is their role in actually facilitating the music into its most complete and desirable form. Now think of George Martin, who was mentioned previously, and the role he played in shaping the Beatles into the greatest band of all time. Now take the song Strawberry Fields Forever. The Beatles were spending a huge amount of time on this dreamscape track. They were recording take after take, and apparently they had up to 55 hours worth of recording tape. That's how much they were working on it. And ultimately, they had to make a decision. It came down to two distinct versions. There was a faster one that had bombastic orchestral arrangements and a gentle, dreamier run-through. While John Lennon was torn, he liked the quiet beginning of the latter and the raucous end of the former. So he kind of liked both. He said, "Why don't you join the beginning of the first one to the end of the second one?" "There are two things against it," Martin replied. "They're in different keys and different tempos." And so this is sort of easy to fix today. But in the analog age, it was super, super difficult. But Lennon wasn't fazed. He had so much faith in his producer. He said, "Well, you can fix it. You'll find a way." Big help Lennon was in that regard, not really grasping how technologically difficult this was, but showed the faith and the trust they had in their producer. So finally, armed with little more than 2 tape machines and a pair of scissors, Martin and his engineer performed a minor mechanical miracle by adjusting the speed on both takes and literally cutting the 2 tapes together at the 60-second mark. That became one of the most famous edits in rock history and created Strawberry Fields Forever, which is just one of the best Beatles tracks. Or, think of Dr. Dre's technique of recreating or supporting his samples with live instruments. That really gives his beats the life and dynamism that make him one of the greatest producers in music history. A lot of music producers for rappers get a sample or get a pre-programmed beat and use that. And while I'm not taking shots at that, that's a very valid way to make a song. Dr. Dre using live bands, live instruments, adds a life to the sound, to the music that elevates it over the competition and brings songs to that next level and sort of shapes the music into its most complete and meet its highest potential. Producers are also a great guide for discovering music you like. So think of someone like Rostam Batmaji or Ariel Reichstag, who, maybe you like their work with Haim or Sky Ferreira, and then you find out, oh, they also did work for Vampire Weekend. And then you go down that rabbit hole and you find every artist they work with. Or think of DJ Premier, who was basically the father of the New York sound and created the New York 90s hip-hop sound that we all associate with New York hip-hop of the 1990s. And his amazing mastery of jazz and funk samples, together with his loops, his heavy scratching, made him his generation and his region's go-to guy, which means any relevant New York rapper of the time that mattered worked with DJ Premier. So if you're like, I want to find the best rappers of the 90s or the best New York rappers of the 90s, just look up DJ Premier beats and you'll find it, because that's the guy who's working with the best of the best. Or think of Quincy Jones, who helped bridge the gap from Motown. He was working with the Supremes with Marvin Gaye, and then he's also working with Michael Jackson. Kind of made Michael Jackson a pop sensation. Basically created the foundation for modern pop music and modern R&B. So any artist who fell in that category from the 1970s, late 1960s to the 1990s probably worked with Quincy Jones, because he was the dude. If you wanted to make hits, if you wanted to make popular music, you worked with Quincy Jones. You'll find all the popular musical acts of the late 20th century then. Just search Quincy Jones production credits. It's a great way to go down a rabbit hole and find the musicians that mattered. And so basically, I know producers are likened to film directors, but I actually think they're more like film screenwriters. They provide the backbone, they provide the blueprint, and they ultimately shape and drive the story of whatever a musician or whatever the art is trying to say. Now, it may be elevated by the actor, it may be shaped into its form by the director, it may be distributed by producers, but you know what? You need the foundation first. That's what a screenwriter provides, and that's what music producers provide. If you have any suggestions on producers I should go into in the future, let us know. After the break, we will round off the podcast with some important music news. Stick around for that.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Music Podcast. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of the podcast. Maybe you're sad, maybe you're happy, but here we are talking music news. A lot happened this week. This past Friday, federal prosecutors charged former R. Kelly manager Donnell Russell with calling in a gun threat to a New York advance screening of the Lifetime television docuseries Surviving R. Kelly in December 2018. Now, that 6-part series explored the allegations that the R&B star had sexually abused women and girls going back to the 1990s. The disrupted screening at the New York's New House Theater was scheduled to include a panel discussion featuring several of Kelly's accusers and a Me Too founder, among others. After the threat was called in, the screening was canceled and the theater was evacuated. Russell, who was Kelly's manager at the time of the incident, is being charged with 2 counts of threatening physical harm by interstate communication and conspiracy to do the same. Friday's charges were filed by prosecutors for the Southern District of New York and the New York office of the FBI. According to prosecutors, Russell's was in Chicago at the time of the screening. They say that on the day of the event, he worked with another individual to draft messages to a Lifetime executive that discouraged the network from airing the series. Prosecutors say that Russell also sent the theater a cease and desist letter to stop the screening, called NYPD and the fire department in an attempt to disrupt the screening, and finally contacted an employee at the theater to say that there was a person in the theater with a gun who was prepared to shoot up the room. Wow. Yeah, that makes you look totally innocent, R. Kelly, when your manager works on your behalf to send a bunch of letters asking for your documentary to not be shown, and then when that doesn't work, create a fake gun mass shooter panic so that they don't show your documentary. Never mind the fact this was a Lifetime docuseries. Like, okay, even if you shut down the theater, it's going to be shown on cable. There's this thing called syndication. There's this thing called repeat that's going to allow the thing to be aired multiple times. I really don't understand what the long-term plan here was. Yeah, just another dumb Sega in this whole R. Kelly business. And to go into the story even more so, judge approved a $75,000 bail package for Russell. And he had to make his first appearance in front of a judge on Friday. Man, R. Kelly, this is not how innocent people behave. This is really not what they do. They don't threaten and harass people. Especially about a film that's on cable. That, again, will be shown over and over again. I don't know what the long-term plan is. Even if you disrupted a screening, it's going to be shown on cable. Not the brightest tools in the shed here. God, that is just unbelievably stupid. In other R. Kelly news, they also filed other charges against him, where they allege that Kelly and his associates, including managers, bodyguards, drivers, personal assistants, and runners for Kelly, as well as members of his entourage, were acting as an organized crime ring. Okay. They contended that Kelly obstructed justice by destroying evidence and bribing witnesses during his last criminal trial, which ended with a not guilty verdict in Chicago in 2008. Kelly is facing 2 sets of federal criminal charges, one in the Eastern District and the other in Illinois. In total, these comprise 22 charges for allegedly abusing 11 girls and women over the course of more than 2 decades from 1994 to 2018. My God, that is a lot. According to prosecutors, 31-year-old Richard Arline Jr., a self-described friend of the singer, Donnell Russell, who we mentioned, and Michael Williams say is a relative of one of Kelly's former publicists, harassed and tried to bribe people. Arlene tried to bribe one of Kelly's accusers earlier this year with a proposed payment of $500,000 in order to keep her from cooperating with the government and testifying against Kelly at trial. Prosecutors also say that Arline claimed that he had been in touch with Kelly while he's being held in custody via a three-way phone call. Russell, prosecutors say, tried to harass and intimidate another Kelly accuser and her mother between November 2018 and February of this year after the accuser filed a civil lawsuit against the singer. Russell is said to have threatened to release explicit photos of the woman and reveal elements of her sexual history if she did not withdraw the suit. Prosecutors also say that Russell, using an alias, sent versions of those photos to producers and executives at Lifetime and A&E Television in 2018, the day Lifetime was to hold an advanced screening of its Surviving R. Kelly docuseries. And Williams is charged with setting fire on June 11th to an SUV that was parked outside of a residence where one of Kelly's accusers was staying in Florida. The SUV was leased by the woman's father. According to prosecutors, investigators also found an accelerant around the residence. Additionally, prosecutors say Williams searched the internet for information about the flammability of fertilizer and diesel fuel, materials about witness intimidation and tampering, and information about countries that do not have extradition treaties with the U.S. R. Kelly is operating like a mob boss to protect his image and his brand, and in doing so has destroyed it even further. Cannot happen to a worse guy. R. Kelly, we are not bumping Ignition anymore. What a terrible human being. Jesus Christ. This is just an insane story that they're intimidating witnesses, trying to bribe them, having fake threats so that no one sees your documentary. Just absolute madness. This R. Kelly story continues to get worse and worse. Just what a saga. In other music news, the New York Times reported that Jared Kushner and Kanye West met privately last weekend in Colorado. Neither the White House nor Kanye West representatives responded to comment. Kushner addressed the meeting himself during a White House press briefing Thursday afternoon, noting that he had been friends with West for about a decade. I kind of find that hard to believe, but anyways, he said, "We both happened to be in Colorado, and so we got together and we had a great discussion about a lot of things. He had some great ideas for what he'd like to see happen in the country, and that's why he has the candidacy that he's been doing. But again, there's a lot of issue that the president's champion that he admires, and it was just great to have a friendly discussion." News of the meeting followed other reports suggesting that Republican-affiliated operatives are working to get West on the ballot in several states. Part of a strategy to use West to siphon votes away from the major party candidates. Once an outspoken supporter of Trump, West told Forbes that he no longer backs the president and that he would argue that he won't argue that he seems to be running a spoiler campaign. Well, your meeting with Jared Kushner, sounds like there might be some collusion there, some partnership, some strategy there. If you were going to run a spoiler campaign, you would probably collude with the major party nominee to design a strategy to where you could cut off the incumbent. Jared Kushner, as we know, is one of the chief political strategists of the Donald Trump White House. So that tracks. Yet another sad chapter in these Kanye West saga here. I cannot believe I'm using the words Kanye West and spoiler presidential campaign. But welcome to 2020. This ride, I don't know if we're ever getting off of it. In other news, without federal intervention, as many as 90% of indie music venues could disappear, according to the National Independent Venue Association. To that end, the newly formed advocacy organization is lobbying hard for legislation like the Restart Act or Save Our Stages Act, which would provide large-scale financial assistance to these endangered institutions. For venues, the clock is ticking. If Congress doesn't pass one of the music industry aid bills circulating its hall before the legislature's August recess, NIVA fears it may be too late. It would be like needing a kidney transplant but not getting the new kidney until after you've expired, says Audrey Fix-Schaefer, a spokesperson for NIVA, who also heads communications for the 930 Club and other Washington, D.C. music venues. It's not going to revive the cadaver. For artists who tend to make the bulk of their income performing live, this could jeopardize the ability to plan successful tours once the pandemic is over. Quote, you can't get on a bus and play on a boarded-up building, Schaefer points out. Across the U.S., drive-in concerts have become a new summertime trend for bigger, typically Live Nation-affiliated acts like Brad Paisley, Nelly, the Avett Brothers, and the Chainsmokers. So, yeah, as we all know, live music is in a bad way with the pandemic, shelter in place. Live music is not going to come back for a long time. It's probably going to be one of the last things that returns. So it's essential that they're bailed out by the government. It's not looking good. I think this excerpt that I'm reading from NPR News here was written before the congressional recess. So I think we're in Congress's recess right now, so that is not a good sign for the live music industry. But you know what? Even with legislation, I don't know how exactly you save it, because you're just stopping the bleeding at that point if you can't host events for a year, maybe 2 years, maybe longer. It's just absolutely devastating. I hate it. It makes me so sad. It should make every music fan sad. It is just another layer of just how terrible this pandemic has been and the long-standing effects it will have. So that's just some really depressing news, especially you try to fathom like 90% of indie music venues. That is unbelievable. And that is a huge loss that you can't repair. So I hope that government can save it, but we'll see what happens. In other news, RZA released a new song to replace the ice cream truck jingle, because apparently the ice cream truck jingle that we all grew up listening to has a racist past. Who knew? Who knew? So the ice cream truck jingle has gotten canceled, and RZA, the architect behind the Wu-Tang Clan, is writing an alternate version. Why not, dude? Why not? I hope he's got some like karate movie samples in there. Maybe some 70s classic action blaxploitation sort of cuts in there too, as he was famous for with Wu-Tang Clan. I would love to see that. And lastly, in music news, before we get out of here, Drake released a music video for his song Laugh Now, Cry Later. God, that's a song title that you're going to be seeing in a lot of Instagram bios, a lot of Tinder bios, maybe in some suburban houses, maybe in some dentist offices. Laugh Now, Cry Later. That is the most Drake title ever, but music video is kind of funny. It's got a lot of cameos from famous artists. The song itself, pretty generic, pretty uncreative, but will probably dominate the charts and be a huge hit because Drake is a robot sent by aliens to indoctrinate us with his choruses, with his moody lyrics, and it's working so far. The man is unstoppable, so it's going to be a huge hit. And he also released his new upcoming album title, Certified Lover Boy. Certified Lover Boy. Drake. Jersey Drake, Certified Lover Boy. If this year could not get any more 2020, there it is. Now that is the podcast. Thank you guys for listening. Remember, this is brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask you that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you. Have a good night. Laugh now. Cry later. I'm out.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.